Welcome to She Persisted. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton, a 19-year-old from the Bay Area studying psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She Persisted is the teen mental health podcast made for teenagers by a teen. In each episode, I'll bring you authentic, accessible, and relatable conversations about every aspect of mental wellness. You can expect evidence-based teen-approved resources, coping skills, including lots of DBT, insights, and education in each piece of content you consume. She Persisted offers you a safe space to feel validated and understood in your struggle, while encouraging you to take ownership of your journey and build your life worth living. So let's dive in. This week on She Persisted.
The therapist and the patient are working together, moving in the same speed, the same direction, like two trains leaving a station on two separate tracks. Are we going the same speed in the same direction to the same next train station? That's therapeutic alliance. It's that real shared collaborative. We're doing this together, two humans, two flawed humans, therapists included, right? We're going to help you figure out how do we get there together.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of She Persisted. I'm really excited for you guys to listen to this one. I went in person to interview Dr. Rosenthal and Grace at the Duke Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation, and we talked about everything you could want to know, both with emotion regulation and misophonia. Dr. Zachary Rosenthal is an expert in DBT and misophonia research. He is a clinical psychologist at Duke University. And Grace Heppes is the outreach and education coordinator at their lab, and so we talk a lot about her lived experience, how you can support someone struggling with misophonia, and how the treatment and research landscape has changed. We start by talking with Dr. Rosenthal about emotion regulation, emotion dysregulation, how this shows up in DBT, what this cycle of emotion looks like, because it shows up in a lot of different ways, especially misophonia and people that find DBT to be effective. So if you are interested in learning more about emotion reactivity, regulation, recovery, DBT, misophonia, all the things, this is an episode you will absolutely enjoy. And if you guys haven't heard of misophonia, I'll give you a quick little definition, though we do touch on it in this episode. It's a chronic condition that causes people to have extreme emotional reactions to specific sounds. So we talk about why we have different emotional reactions to things, how we can cope with them, and then also specifically with misophonia, which is a new area of research and is a really interesting way to apply a lot of this knowledge about emotion regulation and the emotion cycle itself. So I really hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Dr. Rosenthal and Grace. I had an incredible time recording it, and so with that, let's dive in. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today on She Persisted. I'm so incredibly excited to have you on the podcast and to talk about DBT and emotion regulation and misophonia. Really important conversation that we were talking off air that not a lot of people are having, but I think a lot of people could benefit from. So I'm really excited to have you both here today.
It is wonderful to be here with you, and what a pleasure to be in person here with you at Duke.
Yes.
Thank you for coming here.
We're coming to you guys from North Carolina, which is different from my normal podcasting setup in Philadelphia. So exciting, and I'm just so glad to do this. So to get things started, I wanted to start with kind of laying a bit of a framework for this episode, which is that we're really talking about emotion regulation, and with that comes reactivity and recovery, which is a very complex topic, and it's something that we all navigate and go through, but we probably don't have the vocabulary or understanding to be like, here are the phases that I'm going through when I experience an emotion or I'm in a stressful environment. And so I was wondering if we could give that insight and definition to listeners about what that cycle and process looks like when we experience emotions, why we experience them differently, how we regulate them, and then what that looks like after the fact, that like recovery cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll do my best to not sound like a really boring professor doing this. I promise. And I may fail. Apologies in advance if I do. But here's the thing. All responses we have in the world always start with sensory input. They always do. Everything we experience starts with what we see or we smell or we taste or touch or what we hear. And what happens is that our brain, super complicated organ, probably roughly around a 3-pound organ, and its basic function, boil it all down, is survival. So what our brain is doing in taking in sensory information is it's trying to make sense of it in a way that gives us an idea about how to respond, to stay away from danger, to stay away from threat, to kind of move through the world in a way that feels safe to us. So this is the first thing to understand is like, there's a lot coming at us every single day, all sorts of sensory input. And that's the trigger, if you will, for then how we make sense of the sensory input, which we could think of as our thinking. So that sensory input plus the way we make sense of it together is going to impact our biology, our body. And I mean throughout our whole body. Our nervous system is way complicated. There's lots of moving parts. And what happens is the sensation, the cognition, all this stuff comes together and poof, instantly, like milliseconds, instantly, we react. And what we call that reaction, we call it an emotion, right? We say, oh, I'm having this emotion. The emotion itself is a word, and it's a word we learn. It's a word we learn from the way we grow up. So people from different parts of the world have some different emotions that they might experience in similar situations. So it's actually really, really complicated. But what happens at the end of the day is we get emotions throughout the day, every day. We react, we have them, we experience them. Now, we may not be aware, we may not put good words to them, but we have them. Sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big, and they last just a few seconds. This is a wild thing. Emotions last seconds, and then they sometimes get triggered again. And now they last more than a few seconds. And now you start stringing them together with more and more and more firing of emotions. And now we start having minutes of emotional experiences, or hours even. Some people might report days of experiencing this. And now this is where we really start to see struggle and distress and so on. Whether we're talking about shame, fear, anxiety, disgust, sadness, et cetera, et cetera. Now the emotion's there, it's intense. Now, how do we cope with it, right? This is the real key in understanding once the emotion is triggered and we react, how long it takes to come back down to where we started is mostly going to be due to how we regulate. And that is a complicated next topic.
Yeah. I think there's this misconception, especially when you're struggling with your mental health, that the way you, quote unquote, should be experiencing life is like no emotion or very little emotion or maybe just positive emotions. That idea that if you were regulating your emotions properly or you could better tolerate your distress, that you wouldn't be having those initial experiences. And I think that's not necessarily the case.
It's absolutely wrong. It's completely wrong. Emotions are there for reasons. Evolutionarily speaking, They make sense. They make total sense. Again, our brains and our bodies, they're engineered really, really well to help keep us going, keep us alive, keep us moving, keep us out of harm's way. And so when we feel an emotion, it's a signal. It means something. And we need to kind of recognize what that is in the moment, try to make sense of it, which is hard to do. That's a big part of emotion regulation. Try to make sense of what does that mean about what I'm experiencing. And it's a kind of self-validation, if you think about it. It's like the emotion itself is a communication to you about what's going on with you in that moment. So we got to listen to it. The other thing that emotions do that's really important, whether we're talking pleasant or unpleasant or whatever, not only do they tell us something, but we use the emotions to tell other people things. So emotions function as communication to others. Faces communicate. Our fists, our shoulders, our hands, the way we hold our bodies, our words, right?
Yeah.
All of it communicates to others. And we need that to be able to function, right? To be able to have the type of relationships and day-to-day functioning that we all are striving to have.
Yeah.
So then the third piece that emotions do is they motivate, right? They motivate actions. They motivate. If we listen to our emotions, they motivate us to do something. Now, is that something skillful and effective, or is that something that might get us into trouble? That's a whole other distinction to make, but they motivate us.
I think it's a lot of people when we think about emotions, our mind immediately goes to ways when they're being ineffective. Like when we think about struggles with emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation, we think about these really extreme examples where maybe that's not going how it should be. And maybe that's populations that DBT is really effective for, whether it's borderline personality disorder or depression, anxiety in some cases. It's not so much that day-to-day cycle that you talked about, which is that our emotions come up, they're telling us something, we probably respond to that signal, hopefully effectively, and then we regulate the emotion and it's kind of just passes without second thought. But we do have these individuals and populations where that doesn't happen effectively. And like you were saying, maybe the emotional signal is lasting for hours or days, or it's more consistent. I don't want to say something's going like quote unquote wrong in that situation, but it's not that typical cycle that maybe most of us experience when we're just navigating our day-to-day lives with these smaller stressors. So when we think about that reaction, regulating, recovery, at what point is that cycle not being as effective as it could be when we see this extreme emotion dysregulation?
Yeah, that's a really good question and probably different for different people,
Yeah.
right? And different settings for the
Mhm.
same person. What's complicated about emotion and emotion regulation
Mhm.
is that there's a whole bunch of other intersecting processes that
Yeah.
come together to give us what we call emotion or emotion regulation.
Mhm.
And so someone might be really distressed and having a really, really hard time functionally. Maybe they're like not hanging with their friends, or they're not able to go to school or do well in school, or maybe they're having a hard time with their family and or work, whatever. So there's this kind of impairment is kind of
Yeah.
like jargon we would use in my world. We'd say there's impairment with day-to-day functioning that's consistent, and it's related to this really intense, big, overwhelmed set of emotions.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, inside of those emotions, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we can help people try to unpack and understand to change all of that.
Mhm.
So whether it's what they're attending to with their attention, or whether it's what they're automatically doing with their actions
Yeah.
before they get triggered, anticipating they're going to be triggered,
Mhm.
or whether it's when they do respond to some sort of really kind of intense emotional type of situation.
Yeah.
What are they doing with their actions, right? Are they approaching? Are they avoiding? Are they escaping?
Mhm.
Are they confronting? Are they, right? There's all these sort of
Yeah.
behavioral things that we can help people with. What are they thinking
Yeah.
before, during, and after the emotional stimulus, if you will, before the thing triggers them?
Mhm.
What are different types of thought processes? Because we can help people change those.
Mhm.
There's really good evidence-based ways, as you know, to change patterns of thinking.
Yeah.
And that can be before somebody's triggered, while they're in that intense distress, or after.
Mhm.
We also can help people with how they communicate, again, before, during, and after. And those communication patterns also, if they change, can change how people think or what they do or how they feel. And then lastly, we have what's going on in people's bodies, right? So that, of course, also can be something we can target changing before, during, or after a
Mhm.
trigger. So I think it's really interesting because all these things come together kind of like in a network, kind of like holistically,
Mhm.
right? Like what you feel, what you think, what you do, what's going on in your body, how you communicate. Those things are not separate from each
Yeah.
other. They're all interrelated. And so if you change one, you can actually change some of the others, all in an effort to regulate.
Mhm. You mentioned different interventions that we can do to be more effective or target these things. DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy is a big one for emotion dysregulation and distress tolerance. I would love to talk to you a bit about training process for that, because what makes DBT really unique is that if you're doing like DBT adherent treatment and you're working with someone who's gone through the training process and they have their board of clinicians that they're working with, you're going to group, you're going through the different phases of treatment, your outcomes are pretty consistent statistically versus when you go to a normal psychotherapy appointment, the number one determinant is your relationship with that therapist, which is really interesting because DBT does lean so much on that skills group part of things and these things that are really set in stone, whether it's phone coaching or we start with phase one, like therapy interfering behaviors or life interfering behaviors and work through this hierarchy. What is it about the training process and what are you guys doing to lead to those outcomes that are so consistent and adhering to this original protocol?
Well, the number one thing, in my opinion,
Mhm.
with training someone in DBT is, and I've been training people for decades. I train people around the world, in China, in the US, a lot in North Carolina, and here at Duke. I've done this for a long time and train a lot of people. And I think the number one thing, if I take a step back with this question, it's really about helping people have and express compassion from the heart for the person in front of them.
Mhm.
But to do that in a way that is aligned with principles of behavior change, including acceptance-based and change-based strategies for
Mhm.
change. So I think it's actually a false distinction to say that there's either, kind of the relationship that
Yeah.
accounts for outcomes in psychotherapy, or there are things like skills
Yeah.
or in DBT or other treatments. I actually think it's both.
Both.
It's definitely, and go figure, I'm dialectical here. So on the one hand, there's this, on the other hand, there's that. The way I tend to think of things is how do we integrate and synthesize so we get a both and here instead of an either or. And the both and is that's what we're trying to train people to do, right? It's to really have strong therapeutic relationship in a DBT context, strong therapeutic alliance. And then the third piece is strong ability to do these really specific kind of DBT principles and skills and so on. That's like a 3-tier layer cake or 3 layers to a cake. The relationship is not the same thing as alliance.
Yeah.
Alliance is the degree to which 2 people, the therapist and the patient, are working together, moving in the same speed, the same direction, like 2 trains leaving a station on 2 separate tracks, right? Are we going the same speed in the same direction to the same next train station? That's therapeutic alliance. It's that real shared collaborative. We're doing this together, 2 humans, 2 flawed humans, therapists included, right? We're real people, but we're going to help you figure out how do we get there together. And that's on top of this really, really strong, compassion-driven, humane, deeply humane relationship that's expressed. So training people on how to do that, and honestly, how to get out of their own way to do that really well, that leads to therapeutic alliance. And then our third kind of the covering of the cake, if you will, what you see, the icing, the flowers, the happy birthday letters, right? What you see on top of the cake, that's the skills, right? That's the let's do a chain analysis and let's do Dear Man and let's do the stop and the tip skill. But that stuff's necessary too. But your question is about training. I want to train people who want and really deeply care about others, but they want to learn how to channel that in a compassionate way that also includes using these evidence-based strategies. It's not either or, it's both.
Yeah. Can we talk about some of those principles? Because I think people that have been in traditional psychotherapy versus when you enter DBT therapy, it's like a very stark difference. And I think that idea of teamwork is very clear. Your first session, you're like, wow, we're on this team together. They're in my corner, which for a lot of patients, you're like, I've never felt this way before. Like you get to the session and they're like, okay, we got to change this behavior. In DBT, it's like, what do you want to work on? What are we focusing on? And obviously there's some like, gotta kind of work on this first so we can get to that later thing that you want to do. But there really is that idea of collaboration. And I think the compassion piece as well, which also can sometimes feel really foreign, especially when your behaviors aren't making sense to those around you. And I liked what you said about getting out of your own way to be able to support someone that's in a position that they're struggling. And I think that's relevant to parents. It's relevant to peers, especially when you want to support a friend. And there's these really specific philosophies that DBT has, like the patient is doing their best, but they can also do better. And you mentioned therapists and people too.
Not but.
Did I say but?
Yeah.
Oh, no. And that's the number one DBT thing, not but.
Right.
The dialectic. And so I'm wondering, are there any of those philosophies or ways that people can be more compassionate and understanding and open to get out of their own ways and support people that are struggling in a way that they don't necessarily understand, or it seems really out of left field or foreign?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a couple things that come to my mind. I love the question. I'll answer it this way first. So the beating heart of DBT as a clinician, the beating heart that I experience week to week is my team of therapists that are the community of therapists working with me and I'm with them. And we're all working together in a way to try to serve all of our patients and clients.
Yeah.
Right. So that beating heart of there's a community of people helping to support each other. And the way we do that is we essentially do therapy for the therapist. That's what we call it. So on our treatment teams, we are doing mindfulness practice every week. We are paying attention to how fatigued we are, how difficult things are in our personal lives. We are supporting each other. We're helping each other get out of our own way of our own tendencies to do this or that, right? So we have this group of therapists that are really providing a type of love and care for each other. And they're doing that in a way to help support doing DBT by the book.
Yeah.
The patient is not lost in this. The patient is at the core of this. But to help the patient, what we recognize is we've got to make sure we are full, we are nurtured. That's not a thing you see in other treatment approaches. And the reason we do that is because these are hard people to work with.
Yeah.
And this is a hard treatment to do. So we have to create structures around us to take care of us so we can take the best care of the treatment and, most importantly, patient.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important and very applicable to parents and just the everyday individual, that you can help others until you can help yourself. And you're going to be able to support them more effectively if you done everything possible to be able to get your needs met and so that you're not pouring from an empty cup, which is common.
That's right. We have to be aware because we're flawed humans. We're just clinicians, right? We're just people. And this is a DBT way to think and talk about this, right? That we are people with some expertise. That's true.
Yeah.
But we also we're real people. We have our own lives and our own stuff. And we want to make sure that we don't let that get in the way.
Yeah.
So when hard things happen in our lives, we talk about it. I recently lost my mother not too long ago, and that's been really, really hard. It was really, really hard losing my mother. I talk about that with my team.
Yeah.
Because I don't want that next patient who has anything that reminds me of my mother. I don't want any of that to interfere with care for that patient.
Yeah.
And it might still anyway, but I want to try to make it be as kind of above board and help me be as aware as possible about that. So again, we're paying attention. We're looking out for each other. And parents listening, you know that what I'm about to say is true because you've struggled with this. When you are trying to find care for your teenage kids or your grown kids, or even your late childhood kids, if you're trying to find care that is DBT-based, you know how difficult it is to know the quality of the clinician by looking at a website. You know this is really, really hard. So here's a hack. A trick is you can ask them if they're part of a DBT therapist consultation team. You can find that out. And the answer is not going to be maybe. It's going to be yes or no, right? And those that are likely going to have the type of support around them that is DBT and is part of really, truly doing an adherent full model DBT program. And the vast majority of those people in America, and I would say probably everywhere, who say they're doing DBT are probably just doing DBT group, DBT skills training, which quite frankly is the least DBT thing about DBT, just the skills. Literally, Marcia, when she made the skills, she collected, it's like she took a basket and walked around the world and picked up skill after skill. Yeah.
Attachment theories.
Does anybody think that Marcia invented mindfulness? I mean, this is like really, truly we could say what we want about it, but it's it's a 3,000-year-old practice. She didn't make it up. She's taken it and she's made it secular to some extent. It's still Zen Buddhist to some extent, but she's really secularized it, modernized it, put it into an evidence-based psychological treatment. She didn't make it up. She didn't make up chain analysis. This is behavioral analysis. This is stuff from the 1960s.
Please skills are not new.
Please skills
we
are
have
not
help.
ours. So you got to kind of think about the skills themselves are fabulous. They're skills for probably everybody. I use the skills regularly. But skills alone are not a way to live every day. It's certainly not, well, maybe more specifically, distress tolerance skills alone are not a way to live every day. Some skills like the distress tolerance skills, these are good in certain moments, but we wouldn't every day want to live just doing stop skill and, tip skill all day long. It would be not such a rewarding life. So takeaway here is that the skills themselves are probably what you're most likely to find, parents listening and patients listening. And they might be really, really helpful. They can be helpful for anybody. But if what you're looking for is sort of full model DBT, ask if the therapist is on a therapist consultation team.
We touched on this a little bit, but I want to circle back, which is that a lot of these ideas aren't new, like having a lot of compassion for the patient and working together as a team and these skills that come from a lot of different psychological theories. These aren't brand new ideas. And yet it was kind of revolutionary to see these kinds of outcomes in this demographic. And you've done some work on this, but there's this mechanism of change that's taking place here. And so I'm curious, obviously it's going to be a dialectic in a number of things, but do you feel strongly that it's like that therapist-patient relationship? It's these basic beliefs and principles we talked about, like these dialectics that are at the core. What do you kind of see as that mechanism for change that makes DBT so different for so many patients compared to trying the skills by themselves at home or just working with an individual therapist?
I think I'm going to answer this two ways. The first is simpler, which is that it's the ability to live your life with more intention, more purpose, more awareness, and more flexibility, which means lots and lots of things.
Yeah.
But that's the short answer, right? It's that ability to do all of those things. A longer way to answer your question is that I think it's the wrong question. And what I mean by that is that I don't think there is a mechanism across all people.
Yeah.
I think that that's actually not the way to think. The way to think about it and the question to ask is, for which people are which mechanisms of which treatment most likely to be helpful and why?
Yeah.
Right. So if you approach it from that framework, it allows you to look at each person a little bit more flexibly, a little bit more like really truly treating each person differently and understanding how people really are different and their patterns are different, their backgrounds are different, their traumas are different, their family histories are different, their brains are different, and so on and so on and so on. So much is different.
Yeah.
So much is so different about each person. So what may help one person really change in DBT may not actually be the same mechanism, singular speaking, as the next person. And that's okay.
Yeah.
I think we can look at mechanisms at different levels. So there might be interpersonal mechanisms. There might be more physiological mechanisms. There might be more behavioral mechanisms. There might be more attentional mechanisms. All of these things, if we boil them down to one, I think come back to like being more flexible, more skillful, if you will, to use DBT language, but being more flexible from a place of intention and awareness.
We talked about trying to be compassionate with behaviors or feelings that we maybe can't empathize with. We can sympathize and be like, I can see you're really struggling. I can see you're in a lot of pain, but I don't understand it. And then it's challenging to take that compassionate lens and as a peer or a parent or a therapist, be a team member and help someone work towards this goal, working towards maybe like phase 2 or phase 3 or whatever it is. And I think an example of that is suicidal ideation. A lot of people don't understand why people are having those thoughts or what would cause them to think that way or why that's the response to their environment, that they're maybe living in the same environment as someone else. And so I'm curious if you can unpack that a little bit and explain, especially from the emotion regulation piece, why there is that strong relationship between struggling to regulate emotions and then suicidal ideation, which a lot of people don't experience in their lifetimes. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding.
Yeah. When somebody has extraordinary suffering, they imagine doing anything they possibly can to end it, to stop it, because it's so extraordinary. I mean, the experience of being deeply in what feels like hell, like really, truly feels unbearable, leads one to imagine what they can do to stop it.
Yeah.
And when each successive attempt to try to stop it, solution after solution, does not seem to stop the pain, ultimately, the person starts to think about ending their life as a type of way to end. And so it becomes this imagined solution. And what can happen for some people is that even thinking about this solution, even thinking about harming themselves, thinking about killing themselves, in the moment they do that can take the edge off of the emotion they're feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's relief in that moment. And that means, in a more sort of jargony way, it's negative reinforcement. It's the reduction of something unpleasant. And anything that reduces something unpleasant for us is likely to be reinforced, meaning it's likely to happen again.
Yeah.
And again, it's the reason why when we shut our doors to our cars and the annoying ding, 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 ding happens with our seatbelts, what do?
Put on our seatbelts.
We put on our seatbelts.
Yeah.
Why? In that moment, why?
We stop the annoying, distressing stimuli.
It's just that.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. So you can think of suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior as a behavior, even the thinking, you can think of it as a type of behavior that has a function.
Yeah.
That actually works in the moment, that actually really does work. And therapists that seek to understand that and lean into that with compassion, well, they might be good DBT therapists because that's really dialectically how we might think about it. It doesn't mean we're going to support it or want it, but it's about understanding and acknowledging the function, the reason why this is happening is it has some effect that works. So it's going to then happen.
Shifting gears a little bit into misophonia, and people listening to the podcast who are interested in mental health and engaged in some way online have probably heard of misophonia before. It's becoming more popular and more mainstream for people to talk about. We hear these conversations online. This is where people are getting their information, and we sometimes have misinformation because we're not coming at it from a research lens. We're not coming at it from really trying to understand what we objectively know about the lived experience and also how we can break it down and understand it in more of a research context. So I'd love to understand what the current definition of misophonia is and also how that shows up in the day-to-day so we can shift.
Sure.
both
Sure.
answers.
So misophonia is a recently defined disorder of decreased sound tolerance, but it's really more complicated than that. You can think of it as an unusually strong reaction, unpleasant reaction to really particular sounds and other cues or stimuli that are related to those sounds. So the word translates literally into dislike of sounds. And that's kind of what it is. It's this strong reaction to particular sounds. Now, the sounds, we often call them triggers, even though I don't love that word.
Yeah.
That's just the word that's used. And typical triggers are mouth or nose or face kinds of triggers. So sneezing, snorting, chewing, crunching, lip smacking, eating, swallowing, slurping, sniffing, throat clearing. Apologies to anybody out there that's getting a reaction even to those words.
I know. It's like there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. They tend to break down into to noises that people make repetitively in their nose or their mouth or their throat. And there are other trigger sounds that are common that are not nose or mouth or throat. Pens clicking, keyboards typing, environmental noises that are repetitive. But in the research studies of people with misophonia, most of the people report having among their primary triggers eating sounds, chewing sounds, and or any of those nasal or throat sounds.
Yeah.
And the reactions to these sounds vary quite a bit. But the way you can think about it is that this is not being bothered by sounds. This is an extreme reaction. Think of it this way. It's kind of like, if you're listening right now and you're kind of tuning me out, here's the thing. Think about this. You feel anxiety sometimes. Most everybody does. If you never feel anxiety, there's maybe something else we should talk about.
See someone.
Right. But
Check that out.
everybody feels anxious from time to time, and that's probably good. But not everybody has an anxiety disorder, right? We can do the same thing if we want with depression. We can say, most everybody could say they've felt sad before. That doesn't mean you have major depression, right? Some people think about things a lot. They might obsess, but that doesn't mean they have OCD, right? So misophonia, think of it as sort of like that. It's the extreme end of sound sensitivity where the sensitivity leads to really strong and very distressing and very, very impairing reactions. The reactions are anger, irritation, disgust, anxiety, really a wide array of different negative emotions. The emotions are hard to regulate because they're unwanted, they're automatic, they're intense, they're disabling in the moment. The student can't focus in class. The student's not being manipulative. They can't actually focus. And there's research studies that have looked at this, that in the brains of people with misophonia, when they're triggered, they lose the ability to learn, to pay attention, to remember, to do the kinds of things we want people to do when they're in classrooms, for example. So these triggers come, they elicit these really big reactions and responses in the brain and throughout the nervous system. And that can then lead to behavioral reactions, often needing to leave the room, to escape, to avoid, or to confront somebody, or to seek out that sound source and try to understand it. If you're still not clear what I'm talking about, these are the people who look at you sideways on the airplane or the bus. They look at you sideways when you open up that bag of potato chips and you start crinkling that bag and you pull up that potato chip and you put it in your mouth and you make that crunching noise. These are the folks that might look over at you.
Death glare.
And there's daggers coming out of their eyes because they're really intensely triggered. I mean, this is not a dislike. This is a really, really unbearable nervous system reaction that is automatic and really, really distressing.
I would love to hear a little bit about the lived experience of that. We have an objective definition of how that can show up, but I imagine one of the biggest areas would also be interpersonal relationships because a lot of those triggers are outside of your control and you have to employ some relationship skills to be able to alleviate the distress or get out of that situation. I'm sure there's a lot of setting intentional boundaries, but how does that show up in your day-to-day with regard to engaging in relationships, things like class, like you guys mentioned, is a really big factor. I can imagine things like eating out or going out with friends. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So I've been reflecting on this a lot in the past week because we got the chance to go to the Misophonia Research Fund meeting last week. And it was funny to hear you say that, like, if you're online and you've probably heard of this thing,
Mhm.
that was I never thought I'd hear that sentence in my life.
Maybe I'm too deep on TikTok.
But I think that the awareness is increasing so rapidly. Like
Yeah.
I turned 23 today. Another reason why I'm reflecting a lot is because I started at 13 is when I started to experience symptoms of misophonia. So it's been 10 years now.
Mhm.
And back then that wasn't in our vocabulary.
Yeah.
And eventually my mom and my older sister found that word out. And when you look it up, everything is negative. It's parents blogging about how their child is suffering so much and they can't do anything.
Mhm.
So I actually refused to look up the word for years
Mhm.
because there was nothing positive. It was, you're getting no help. And I can't believe how fast that is changing right now. And when we went last week, there were 21 studies being presented, ongoing studies, and I cried several times
Yeah.
during the meeting because I couldn't believe that there was so much work being done, and all around the world too. There are people from Poland. There are being studies being done with people in South Korea. It was just, I couldn't believe it. Something that I didn't think I would see, and not within 10 years at
Mhm.
least. And I just can't believe that hearing you say, like, you've probably heard of this.
Yeah.
It really does blow my mind. And I'm so grateful that people are finally learning what it is. And I don't have TikTok, but my friends send me the links to them all the time of
Mhm.
people, whenever someone mentions misophonia, my phone blows up because everyone I know sends me that TikTok. And it really does warm my heart that people are finally finding out. And talking about relationships, something I've been thinking about a lot recently is the relationship I have with my parents. And we spent years going to different doctors. I grew up in New York. We would drive in Jersey and different parts of the state just to find someone who could help me. And it was a nightmare. I would go to these doctors and they would be asking me what misophonia was.
Mm.
And I would just immediately break down on the spot. And I would get upset with my parents because I feel like I need to put the blame on someone, and I would be upset. Why are you bringing me to these people and they don't even know what this is? And I'm a child and I have to explain this to them, and I'm asking them for help. And why are you bringing me to these people? And looking back on it now, like, I have so much empathy for what my parents went through during that time of they just wanted to help me, and I was so frustrated. They were too, but there was nothing there.
Yeah.
There was no one saying we can help. Or if they were, there was no evidence behind it.
Mhm.
And I really feel for my mom and dad looking back now. And it's hard to see it in that moment when you are dealing with so much. And I was so overstimulated all the time of I wore headphones all the time in my own home because my walls were thin. I shared a room with my sister until I was like 15. And I felt like there was no escape. And that definitely affected my relationship with my parents because they're also my biggest triggers. I can't even hear my dad breathe. It's really hard to be in the same room as my parents, unfortunately, if there's not some sort of background noise. And I love them so dearly and they've done nothing wrong,
Yeah.
but I can't stand to be in the same room as them sometimes.
Mhm.
And going out to eat, growing up, I just felt like this annoying teenager because I would have my headphones in and I'd be like in the corner of the booth, not looking at anyone. The waitress would come up and I would like not even see them come up. And I'd be like, they probably think that I'm just this annoying, bratty teenager just listening to her music and is having these hormonal changes, is being dramatic. I'm the youngest of 4 as well, so that was also something I heard a lot was, "Get over it." Like, "What are
Mhm.
you doing?" When I would get upset at dinner, and one time my oldest sister said to me, she's like 8 years older than me, so she was away at college for a lot of this time, a lot of when the onset happened, and didn't really see my day-to-day difficulties as my other siblings did, and she came home for break once and said, "You haven't gotten over this yet?" Even my other sister was like, "Oh, she shouldn't have said
Yeah.
that."
Yeah.
So that even just getting that understanding within my own household took a long time, let alone outside of it. I was so afraid to tell anyone outside of my house.
Mhm.
The first time I told my friends, I was at a sleepover with two of them and they were eating pretzels, and I just broke down. I hadn't told anyone about it, and they immediately were like, "What is wrong?" And it took me a while to even get the words out, and they were so supportive and made sure that they didn't do those things around me, and that allowed me that experience, because I was so afraid people wouldn't believe me,
Mhm.
because there was nothing on it and no one knew what this was, and it was embarrassing, and I felt guilty for telling people to stop eating,
Mhm.
which is something that everyone has to do, and that's also something that I would hear in my house too in, like, the very beginning was, "Well, I have to eat," and my dad said that to me actually last year, and that it brought me back.
Mhm.
Like, it's how devastating that time period was for me really came back to me in that moment of, like, I got this, like, rush of just, "Oh my god," of me being kind of grateful that I don't experience that day to day anymore, but also, like, it is so frustrating to hear things like that.
Yeah.
And someone asked me last night, actually, "Well, what's the difference between just being annoying?" And I was in a social setting, and I feel like I've been, because I work here now, I'm in this setting where people are understanding me,
Yeah.
and I don't have to explain myself to people. And I just kind of shut down because I felt like my 13-year-old self again, of not being able to explain things and feeling like no one's going to believe me.
Mhm.
And I'm just so grateful that the research is happening and that people are hearing this word now. And sometimes when I ask people if they've heard of it, some people are saying yes now, and
Mhm.
they never did.
Yeah.
They never did. I always had to explain it. Or at least they're like, "Oh, it's something with sounds, right?" And then I'm able to build off of
Yeah.
that. But it's really, really hard day to day, and having to decide what social events I'm going to go to or how I'm going to handle them.
Mhm.
And even going to a meeting yesterday here, knowing that it was going to be during lunch and having to decide whether I was going to risk going down there. And I did, and it was hard, but I knew that I had the option of walking out if I needed to, because I'm in an understanding environment.
Mhm.
But in other situations, it's not like that, where you feel like you have
Yeah.
to explain yourself and just feel like no one's going to believe you.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, there was a class that I was in, and one of my classmates was given permission to eat their lunch. And I told my teacher, like, I need to leave, because I had a 504 plan
Mhm.
to be able to leave if I needed to. And he looked me in the eye and said, "Do you actually have to?" It's like, whoa.
I think you're allowed to ask
Yeah,
that.
that was wild. And I went home very upset, and my mom sent this like 6-paragraph email to all my teachers, and she said, "If one of the kids in your class had a peanut allergy, you would not let someone eat peanuts." I'm not going to go into anaphylactic shock, obviously, but I am suffering when I
Yeah.
hear those
It's
sounds, and
debilitating.
it's debilitating. I can't pay attention. What's the point of me sitting there?
Mm.
And it's so harmful. And I remember when my memories actually of the onset are very foggy, because it was such a dark time for me and very confusing. And I just remember sitting at the dinner table, bawling my eyes out, just not understanding why I felt so tortured just by hearing my family.
Mm.
And just this feeling inside my chest of like, I am in so much danger right now when I'm actually not. And that I just had the need to leave.
Mhm.
And I just, yeah, it's so hard to explain in the feeling in words.
Yeah.
But that, I think danger is probably one of the best.
I once had a patient tell me that it's like having a grizzly bear suddenly, out of nowhere, unpredictably sitting next to you.
Mhm.
And in terms of how your body feels, it's that really intense, sudden surge of threat is present.
Mhm.
Threat. There's something, and that's what's happening biologically in the brain, is the sound pathways seem to be intersecting with the emotion pathways and eliciting this really automatic, overwhelming, there's danger, there's threat. And then the threat reactions behaviorally and cognitively follow.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned headphones, background noise. There were some things that were incredibly invalidating as responses. but you said more recently it's been different in a positive way. What has been helpful as far as boundaries being set, skills being used, even just having a more nuanced understanding of the experience itself, I imagine is really helpful. What has been helpful in your journey?
I think the validation of even just being in the meeting last week, of seeing so many people working on it, and
Yeah.
that there are people putting in this effort to help us, because I think all of us felt so alone for so long.
Yeah.
And I think having those papers being published and all of these things and moving towards a place where we can better understand it, I think does make me feel better. And I think I also have different expectations of people too, and that applies to my triggers. And I think that's might be part of why people get more triggered by their family, is they expect them to understand and
They
stuff
also
like
have
that.
no boundaries, though. Siblings
Right.
especially, it's like you don't expect the decorum at the table. There's like
Right.
you're not using manners, so it's so much worse.
Right. No, you're right. So it's that, and I don't really know, because I've gone to therapy, but I don't really know if we used, and like, it wasn't DBT. I don't know I didn't find it helpful in the
Yeah.
beginning, but it was helpful to talk to someone.
Yeah.
And I think just over time, learning to regulate my emotions as I grew up as well, and being in different environments, being in more understanding environments as well. Like at work, I don't have to worry at all,
Yeah.
because we're working with misophonia, people understand. And at home, it's much better now that if I need to step out, people aren't yelling at me or judging me and aren't upset by it. So I think it's still very difficult with strangers. They trigger me less, but I still have that feeling of embarrassment, guilt.
Yeah. Yeah. I think DBT especially comes from this lens of like you always have the choice. And I think you have a more nuanced understanding of that as you get older, where yes, there's things we have to do and we have to go through and be in certain environments, but you do have a lot of autonomy and choice over who you surround yourself with and the boundaries you set and who you're choosing to put in your circle to support you. And whether that's in high school or college, you just have a lot more choice there than I think we initially think, especially because as we're younger, so many of those relationships are defined for us, like parents and siblings and family friends and the classroom you're in. But you really do have a lot of autonomy to build that community to set you up for success.
Right. And I think that that's also the difference, is I'm so much more in control of my own life right now. I don't live in the same home as my family members now. And college, like you said, you can choose your friends.
Yeah.
High school, you're like
Told where to go.
Yeah, you're told where to go. You have this set schedule every single day, and you have to ask to go to the bathroom. Like there's these set rules that you have to follow, and you've been following them for 13 years.
Yeah.
So it's much more structured, and you have no control over it. So that's also a really hard part of being a teenager, is feeling like you have less control over things. But I hope that there will be more education and people will be able to allow teenagers to have more control over, especially with mental health and misophonia, and accommodating them and making their own decisions that would help them.
Absolutely.
So 2 thoughts on this part of the dialogue. One is that as people age, they tend to be able to, generally speaking, kind of get a little bit better at regulating emotions. It's really, really hard to do that when you're a teenager. It's hardest, probably in general, to do that when you're younger. And you learn in lots of ways. And life hopefully allows you privileges to help you be able to learn more easily how to be in control of what you feel and who you're around and the environment and so on. So all of that and therapies you might do, or whatever, you might do all sorts of things to develop really good coping strategies to deal with hard stuff. So that's generally true for everyone. I think this question about teens and misophonia and the environments, I really think about this dialectically. And maybe that's because I'm a DBT person. I don't know. Probably. That's probably why. But I think about it this way. I think that on the one hand, we probably do need to provide more support, more structural support in school systems and in environments. I mean, probably we need to think about noise and noise generally for all people as an irritant and as something that is a stressor. And this is scientifically shown in lots of studies around the world, that just noise, lots and lots of noise, is kind of like not great.
Like, why do we take tests in quiet? Because people need to focus.
Right, exactly. So I think on the one hand, systems, whether they're school or whether it's work or whether it's wherever, systems do need to accommodate better around noise and around noise sensitivity for everyone, and especially for people on the tail end of this distribution who have misophonia or other sound intolerance disorders. So I think that's true. They do need to. However, I think on the other hand, the person themselves also needs to accommodate the environment that they're in. There's a little bit of a dialectical here, is that we can't expect the world to completely accommodate all people with misophonia. That's just not realistic. It's not realistic for anybody with any condition to be accommodated by all people everywhere all the time. Right? That's just not real.
Yeah.
But we can strive in that direction as long as we're balanced by, and what can that person do that's reasonable, that's feasible, that's skillful, that's effective for them, given their culture, given their identities, given their context, right? Given who they are, what can they do, right? And I think that's really hard. That's a hard thing. And this is something that therapists can help people sort through. Therapists can help be reasonable and flexible. And therapists can also support people with misophonia by helping to write letters of support for them for requests at school and accommodations and such. So finding that balance and finding that blend, I think, is really an important way to look at this.
Yeah. And you mentioned blame and shame as being like those really strong initial emotions. I think there's so much benefit in talking through those really intense emotions, especially when they've been building up for years. And therapy can be a helpful setting for that, because you don't move through those overnight. And once you're back in those dynamics or relationships, it can continue to arise. And so even getting to that point of like, I want to implement skills, or I want to accommodate the environment, while also requesting that the environment accommodates me, having someone to support you through that process to even get in that headspace is really important too, and doesn't happen overnight and takes a lot of work for sure. You guys are putting out a lot of information and media, and you guys mentioned there's a lot of research still coming out. So if people want to follow along with that or keep up with you guys and your lab, where can they do that?
Our website, www.misophonia.duke.edu, and our Instagram, Duke Center for Misophonia.
Amazing. I'll put that in the show notes. And thank you guys so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of She Persisted. If you enjoyed, make sure to share with a friend or family member. It really helps out the podcast. And if you haven't already, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also make sure to follow along at She Persisted Podcast on both Instagram and TikTok, and check out all the bonus resources, content, and information on my website, shepersistedpodcast.com. Thanks for supporting, keep persisting, and I'll see you next week.